Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ifft, and I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. Hello, welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ifft. I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. Today, I'm excited to have Veronica Nigh here, who's an economist at the Fertilizer Institute. Veronica, welcome. Can you start with telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. I'm Veronica Nigh. I'm a native of Missouri. I'm very much a show me state native. I've carried that with me my whole life. I've been in DC about, almost 20 years. I started at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the Foreign Ag Service. I did about a 12-year stint proudly with the American Farm Bureau as their international trade economist. And then I've now been the chief economist over at the Fertilizer Institute about 2.5 years. And that whole time, it's hard to get away from international trade. And now that I'm here with the TFI and proudly representing our members, it's come in very handy because this is very much a globally traded commodity. And man, there's been a lot to talk about.
Yeah. I can imagine they're very happy to have you on board these days. But can you start off just telling us a little bit about the Fertilizer Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a trade association that represents about 260 members. We have members both that are in the United States and outside of the U.S. Our members are anybody who produces, wholesales, retails fertilizer in the United States, and then associated industry. So, folks who move fertilizer or store it, things along that lines. So we've been around for a very long time and are very proud of our members and what they do here in the U.S.
Okay. They always agree.
Yes.
So fertilizer, like you said, it's a very hot, or it's a hotter topic than ever today. I'd like to ground this discussion in a few facts. So could you provide a few facts for fertilizer? Maybe start pretty basic. For me, it's NPK, and then it gets a little iffy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I actually am going to start at NPK because for a lot of folks in the fertilizer is just kind of one word, but NP and K all are produced differently and they trade differently, and that all matters. And in the last, kind of since post-COVID, it's mattered a lot. So I think I'd start there, and that I really think of fertilizer markets as there was a pre-2020 world, and then there's been a post. Pre-2020, you may have paid more for fertilizer at some point than you wanted. I mean, it's a critical input. It's a significant expense, but it was there. It showed up more or less. It was always there. Since 2020, we've had back to back disruptions in the supply chain. And I think it helps a lot to know where fertilizer is coming from. So let's start with nitrogen. Nitrogen, as long as you have a feedstock, and most countries use ammonia as that feedstock, you can produce nitrogen anywhere. So from a fertilizer basis, ammonia is the building block of all nitrogen fertilizers. In the U.S., we use predominantly ammonia, UAN, or nitrogen solutions, kind of depends on how you want to talk about it, or urea. It's kind of like 30-30-30 split, and then other. It takes over kind of that other remaining 10. So in the US, we do direct apply ammonia. In the rest of the world, they don't. We're really the only country in the world that does a lot of direct application of urea. So nitrogen is by far the largest used nutrient. Then we go into phosphates. This one then becomes a little bit different because it is a mined nutrient. You either have it or you don't. And there's really only about 4 countries that have significant resources of phosphate. That's China, Morocco, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. Phosphate is a surface mined, or about 100 foot down mined nutrient. We do have significant resources of phosphate here in the U.S., but it kind of pales in comparison to those other big 4. And then you've got potassium, the main product being potash, and that's really kind of a 3-horse game. That's Canada, Russia, and Belarus are where you have the big deposits. And that is a mineral that is mined way down deep. So you have to that's really, really far down. We have a bit of that resource here in the US. So, when you kind of think about then those three nutrients, nitrogen gets traded the most, and it is like that is produced by the largest number of countries. But there's kind of some big blocks depending on who has ammonia, basically. So there's a difference between really who's producing nitrogen and who's exporting nitrogen. So from an exporter perspective, it's kind of like ammonia. China is the largest producer and user of ammonia and nitrogen in the world, but it's kind of like the corn market. They're also because they're a large user, they're not always a large exporter. And so like USDA doesn't always talk about China in the corn market, we don't always talk about China in the same way in the fertilizer space. When we talk about those products, who's a major exporter changes quite a lot. So on the ammonia side, your largest exporters might surprise you. Trinidad and Tobago is the world's largest exporter of ammonia, followed by Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Algeria, and then the US. We're the fifth largest exporter. Ammonia is a little bit tough to export. Because it is a gas, right? So it's more difficult to handle. Then when you move into urea, that's the world's largest produced and traded and used nitrogen fertilizer. About 30% of all of the urea that's produced globally is traded. So it's the most responsive to changes in global trade patterns. Compare that to ammonia, where only about 7 to 8% of all the ammonia that is produced globally is traded. So when we look at urea, main exporters change quite a lot. So the top exporter is Russia. And then we look at then there's a lot of large participants from the Middle East. And then you've got some folks in Southeast Asia. And then the US, we do export some urea, but we're pretty far down. We're like 13th. UAN, there's just a few players. You've got Trinidad and Tobago, and you've got Russia. And there's not nearly as much international trade of urea. On phosphates, now this one's a little bit interesting. We don't really trade rock because plants, if you put rock on plants, they're like, thanks very much. I'll take gravel. It's equally useful. We talk about trade in processed phosphates, MAP, DAP, TSP, right? Monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, triple superphosphate. So when we talk about processed phosphates, the export picture is very different from the top producer perspective. Your top producer of processed phosphates by far is China. And we'll talk about them a lot as we go through this, particularly in the phosphate space. But they are not the world's largest exporter. Morocco is the world's largest exporter. But the largest producers and the largest exporters, the deck chairs change as far as who's who, but it's basically the same main four. So those main exporters take up, let's see, Morocco's 30% of exports, China's 20%, Saudi is about 15%, and Russia is about 15%. So you add those up, and that gets us to a really large share of global exports coming from a very few number of countries. Potash, very similar. The last complete year of trade, Canada was nearly 40% of global exports. Russia was about 20%, and Belarus was about 20%. So 80% of all exports of potash coming from 3 countries. So that's a lot of facts. But what I mean by all of this is that when we kind of look at these big blocks of who's who in the zoo, and we think about what's happened over the last few years, not a lot of stability stands out, right? And when there's big pockets of instability and the world is trading a huge amount of this product and it's going around and we're all basically clamoring for the same resource. Growers around the world are clamoring for that resource. It has brought a lot of instability to markets when we felt that in the US, obviously, and growers around the world have felt that. So it has been a volatile dynamic over the last many years. And unfortunately, I hesitate to say this, but given those underlying dynamics, I don't really see in the near term a move back to a pre-2020 world anytime soon.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, wow. So listening to that feels a little stressful, to say the least.
It is a little.
I mean, you all,
yeah,
like all major global conflicts, you are right there. One thing I would like to sort of maybe clarify or give me some numbers is the share of fertilizers that are manufactured. I'm not sure if that's the right term, manufactured
Yeah.
or mined, and then how important that is to crop production or crop yields globally.
Um, nearly over 95% of nutrient use in the US. And as far as traded, globally traded nutrients, nearly
Right.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So absolutely, animal use are, organic fertilizers are incredibly important and play a significant role here in the US and other parts of the world and are an important part of the picture. But as far as their dynamic from a trade perspective, they do play a fairly small role.
Yeah, I absolutely could imagine that. And do you have a number about the impacts on yield or production?
So there was a study about 10 years ago that
Mhm.
associated about 50% of yield to fertilizer use.
So it's a big deal.
Not insignificant.
Yes, exactly.
And when this goes back quite a few years to my, school days, but at least the literature back then certainly suggested that fertilizer was the element that growers in developing countries, at least, was the thing that they chose to use first because that's the thing that they are able to control the most, right? As a grower, which I have never been, so I, I would never pretend to know somebody else's business, but there's so much out of a grower's control, right? There's
Yeah, absolutely.
so if there is something that is in your control, fertilizer and how much you apply and what you apply is. And so that is something that we do see as a management decision that folks make year in and year out.
Okay. So I'd like to if like you to give a sort of a broad sort of overview or maybe a list of the key policy issues that the Fertilizer Institute works with. I think trade is obviously up there, global conflict, but can you just provide us an overview and then we'll break down as much as we have time for?
Yeah. So, of course, we'll set trade aside and because we'll talk about that here in a
Yep,
second.
yep.
But from a domestic perspective, I talked a lot about the other producers in the world, but the US is pretty nutrient rich to be, and I shouldn't overlook that. And I probably should have led with that. We produce about 65% of all the fertilizer that growers in the US require. We produce about 65% of that domestically. We have a lot of nitrogen production. We have a lot of phosphate production. We don't have a lot of potassium production. We import the vast majority of that, and the vast majority of that's coming from Canada. But by and large, if you look at our total NPK usage on an annualized basis, 65% of it's domestically produced. We would like for that to be higher, to be real honest. But building one of our facilities is expensive and it takes quite a long time. Building a new ammonia plant takes 3 to 5 years once you've got the permits in place and $3 to $5 billion. A phosphate mine takes about 10 years to get new permits. So these facilities are no no small feat to get a new facility brought up. So, and a lot of that, frankly, is the permitting side. So, one of the things that we struggle with to get a new ammonia plant in place is a lot of that's Clean Air Act related. Looking at and a lot of that constraint is just the amount of time, right? And and this goes back to my Farm Bureau days, but growers deal with it a lot as non-point source contributors. We are point source contributors
Yep.
because we are, a large chem
Hmm.
facility. So we're applying for those permits when we want to build a new facility. But it's years and years and rounds to try to get a
Right.
new permit. And that's not just for a new facility, that's for
Right.
expansion as well, right?
Right.
So a lot of it is ozone related, a lot of it is particulate matter related.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then on the phosphate side, we run into challenges around NEPA, which is you're familiar with NEPA, and then also PG reuse. So in the US, when you when you make phosphorus a fertilizer, there is a byproduct. And in the every other phosphate producer in the world, they've found a secondary use for that byproduct. In the US, the EPA has said we're not so sure about that.
Okay.
So in the US, we stack it and
Okay.
then we maintain those stacks.
Okay.
And so that's obviously a pretty significant cost to maintain those
Right.
stacks.
Right.
There's also quite a lot of sort of held up nutrient left in those PG piles. So a little bit of FOS left, but one of the bigger deals is you've got a lot of sulfur left over. And in today's
I've
world,
yeah,
looking at what sulfur markets are, that's a pretty significant nutrient to leave on the table. A lot of growers can use it as a soil amendment, and that's what you see in Brazil. That's what you see in other parts of the world.
okay,
So
okay,
that's for us. It's the main constraint. Isn't it on the permitting side? And then on the trade side, of course, there has been quite a lot of uncertainty there. Growers have been faced with that as well, of course. Whether or not tariffs are in place changes the. We've had some tax policy that sent some signals a few years ago that we'd like to see more low carbon ammonia related facilities built here in the U.S.
yeah,
There were some tax credits put in place that encouraged that development in the Inflation Reduction Act. Then we
yeah,
had both candidates sort of in the presidential election having some questions about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the tax
yeah,
policy. And that
right,
sort of chilled a lot of that investment. And then there's been some change to those since then.
right,
And that has put a bit of a dampening effect on additional capacity growth there. And then of course, when we look at the tariffs that are still in effect, the additional tariffs on all of the steel and aluminum and the machines and all of the things it takes to build a plant, that all changes the ROI to
yeah,
build a facility. So there's a lot of sort of mixed signals out there on adding additional capacity here in the US. So, I'd say those are kind of from a domestic standpoint, the things
okay,
that we're a bit most focused on.
okay, okay, gotcha. All right. So trade, policy certainty, uncertainty, and then the environmental regulation all
Yeah.
factor in.
It doesn't sound that different from what I seem to remember from a perspective other
Yeah,
than our labor issues are a little different. Ours is not so much temporary worker availability, but a lot of our facilities are in rural areas, and
yeah,
maintaining a steady workforce is everyone has that challenge, and attracting that workforce is something that
yeah,
our certainly we deal with. Then I left out transportation.
yep,
Moving fertilizer is a big deal.
yep,
Most
absolutely.
of our product will touch all three modes of transit by the time it gets to a grower. That 35% of product that is imported will, if it's Canadian, it's more than likely to come in via rail, but the rest of it will come in via vessel, right? And then a lot of it travels via barge up the Mississippi. And then a lot of it is then railed to destination and then trucked. So there's a lot of ways that can
Yep,
be challenged. So transportation issues are also pretty big and for front of mind for us as well.
absolutely. And on the trade side, I mean, it's the global trade is so important and critical. And we couldn't produce crops with it, but you also have members who are producing domestically. So I could imagine that's quite a balancing act in terms of how you approach trade policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing about fertilizer, well, there's a lot of interesting things about fertilizer, but right, we have very strong seasonal demand for fertilizer.
Yep.
And I'll just put on my economist hat very strongly here. Very strong seasonal demand, but in the rest of the year, demand is pretty low, right? But fertilizer production is very steady month over month. These are chem facilities that have a
Storage.
pretty steady production level, and our products don't store necessarily all that well, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah.
voluminous.
Right,
Some of them are not terribly safe to store for long
right,
periods of time.
right.
And so from a trade perspective and from a just a cost of per unit, it
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense for the US to import product during our high season of demand and to supplement domestic production. And it makes sense for us to export product during our low season of demand. Now, does that cause conflict? Certainly. Does that mean that when we see disruptions and normal trade flows, there's certainly challenges there, and would you want that to be, would someone want that to look different in a particular moment in time? From putting on my economist hat, I'm very very sympathetic to that um that discussion. In a normal situation, that helps keep fertilizer costs much lower because we're not paying the cost of, even if it did store well, right? It keeps the cost of storage from creeping into the price of fertilizer.
Yeah, yeah. I hadn't thought about the seasonal part. I think that's a great point.
This little tidbit: about 75% of all fertilizer demand in the U.S. is attributed to corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton.
That sounds right.
So,
Yeah.
if we think about their application windows, that's pretty short, right?
Yeah, yeah. You got winter wheat, but otherwise it's
Yeah,
and it's
that's
increasingly.
that's a lot needed in a very short amount of time, which drives a lot of our issues, our transportation issues. I mean, it's not all that different from grain storage, right? There's a lot of it needed to be stored at a very
Right.
very short window.
Right. So I was lucky enough to go. I happened to sit on the hearing. It was probably 2 months ago now. And short PSA, that was so cool. Anyone off the street can come into a hearing. And I don't think I've ever been so close to so many senators. So yeah, if anyone's ever in Washington, that is a very cool thing to do. But I went away thinking that there's a sulfur apocalypse, and I think that's probably the wrong language to use. I don't want to be alarmist. Can you help me understand the sulfur issue?
Yeah, it is. You used that word, I did not, but it's not all that.
And it's probably too much hyperbole there.
It's not all that far out, to be real honest, at the moment. In the general broad strokes, about 50% of all exportable supplies of sulfur are produced in the region that is now cut off by the Strait of Hormuz closure. About 20% of exportable supplies of sulfur come out of Russia, and about another 10%, 15% come out of Kazakhstan. Russia is Kazakhstan's outlet for exports of sulfur. Russia earlier this year cut off their exports of sulfur, and they also told Kazakhstan, thanks so much, but we're not going to allow you to move your sulfur exports via our rail system. So in this moment in time, the only place you can get sulfur is the United States and Canada.
Okay.
You cannot make phosphate fertilizers without sulfuric acid. So, and sulfuric acid, about 60% of it is used to make phosphate fertilizers. So we are by far the largest user. But even at that, sulfuric acid is the world's largest used chemical. It is used in water treatment. It is used in metal extraction. It is used in the production of nylon fabrics. It is used all over the place in lots of different ways that you wouldn't expect. So that the fact that there's only a very small amount of sulfur available wouldn't surprise folks that the price of sulfur the market fundamentals have just really driven that price up pretty considerably. We were already, we'll just say, at the beginning of about 2025, we were sitting at about $150 a ton on sulfur. Today, prices are trading over about $1,200 a ton. So that means that U.S. phosphate producers are trying to get sulfur. That means Moroccan phosphate producers are trying to get sulfur. Brazilians, Chinese, anybody we're all trying to get those very limited tons. I'll also mention that sulfuric acid is used as a jump starter for petroleum production. So there's a lot of folks looking for sulfur. So the interesting thing about sulfur is that it's a byproduct of petroleum production and natural gas production. And you just have to go back a few years, and they were literally paying people to take sulfur away.
Yeah,
it was like
crazy.
Negative $40 a ton. But now it is, $1,200-$1,300 a ton. So the fact that where it's being produced, not a lot of theft potential at a petrochem facility.
There you go.
Yeah, it's they're pretty secure.
Yep, absolutely.
So the interesting kind of thing here is that once the Strait of Hormuz reopens, and I'm an eternal optimist, it's going to reopen, but it's going to take a really long time for the sulfur trade to unwind, because what we've seen is, so I mentioned the fact that the largest producers of phosphates are Morocco and China. Combined, they're nearly 60% of global production of processed phosphates between those two countries. They have typically stockpile sulfur. In order for them to have been maintaining their production, because neither of those countries have domestic production of petroleum, and they both import nat gas, they both import oil. So in order for them to have continued to produce their domestic supplies and exportable supplies, in the case of Morocco, they've dipped into their reserves of sulfur. So once the strait reopens, right, everyone's going to be clamoring for those new tons of sulfur. Plus, we're going to have these giants who are looking to restock their supplies. So, and then I should mention, we've got the elephant in the room is that we've got the elephant in the room, is Chile. They're the world's largest producer of copper. They are a huge importer of sulfur, and they've kind of been sitting out of the market in a similar way. They've been dipping into their reserves of sulfur. Their imports are down like 26% this year relative to the same time period last year. The price of copper is like $13,000 a ton. Dap and Dap are expensive relative to where they were a few years ago. But even at $800 a ton relative to a $13,000 a ton product, who's going to be able to pay for those sulfur tons once they're available, right? So the pressure on the sulfur market is unfortunately going to be there for quite a long time. And as a result, we've seen like Morocco's currently sitting at like about 50% curtailment on their phosphate production. We've seen U.S. producers announce curtailments on production. It's not because any folks want to, right? They physically cannot get their hands on sulfur.
Right. So it's absolutely a big part of the story of what's going on right now.
Yeah. And the other thing, even before the Strait of Hormuz closure, the fact that sulfur is a byproduct, and we kind of think of what oil consumption looks like and the long term on oil consumption. And that's a little worrying to me, right? At least in the United States, as we're looking at more electrification. China's looking at more electrification. India is now moving more towards electrification away from oil. Start worrying a little bit in a 10-year out period and a 20-year out period. Like, what does long-term sulfur production look like?
Sounds like there needs to be some investment or R&D into new technologies.
Exactly.
We're all pretty short-term focused right now, but.
And we didn't used to have to apply sulfur, right? But then we solved it's a good thing, right? We solved the acid rain problem, but now the soils are calling for it. Now we're applying it as a nutrient, as a fertilizer. But we've got a long-term challenge, and we got a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term challenge in the sulfur space.
Absolutely. So do you mind if we pivot to data for a bit?
Yeah, please.
So from what I understand, there's two aspects: is just getting better data out about costs, and then there's some talks about mandatory reporting. Maybe talk about the data first.
Sure.
What does that look like?
Yeah. So, we would also love more data. And there was the RFI out of USDA. Man, it feels like a long time ago now, but I think that was just earlier this spring, right? March or April. And our comments are public, as everybody else's are. But we took the opportunity to point out that over the last 40 years or so, the amount of data that USDA publishes on fertilizer has dwindled to nearly nothing. And they used to publish quite a lot, right? So if you go back to like 85, that was the last time USDA published a comprehensive report on fertilizer consumption. They have the ability. It's tough. That fertilizer consumption data, others have tried to pick up that mantle. It went to, after USDA dropped it as a report, it went to TVA, and they published it for about 10, 15 years. And then we've been working on it with partnership with the American Association of Plant Food Control Officials, AFCO. We published what's known as the Commercial Fertilizer Report. But how that report comes together is basically a collection of data, the taxing authorities in every state. So fertilizer is taxed at the state level rather than at the national level in the US. And that is the measurement of fertilizer, the best measurement of fertilizer consumption that we have. And that's so back when USDA used to publish the commercial fertilizer report, that's how they did it the same way. They collected it from those state control officials, but they had the resources of USDA, right? And the number of people. And when they were doing it, they would publish total fertilizer consumption data within like 2 months after the end of the fertilizer year. That was in 1985, prior to all of the beautiful technology we have now, right? So if we don't know the demand side, we're at a bit of a loss, right? And my industry would love to have that as well. Now we just published, hold on to your hats, the 2018 Commercial Fertilizer Report.
Gosh.
AFCO is a volunteer organization. My econ department here at the Fertilizer Institute, you're looking at half of it.
Gosh.
So we're trying, but we all know state departments of ag are squeezed, and getting AFCO and TFI, their consumption data is to be very low on their priority list. Anyway, we don't have a complete demand picture. USDA tried, they have their chem use survey, which is super helpful. And they, at one point, were publishing that annually on crops. Then the corn slipped to every 3 years. Now, the most recent, I haven't seen it, right? I think the most recent is from like 2022.
Yeah.
Now, we need those to be annualized information, right? So better consumption data. On the USDA also used to publish like a comprehensive report on basically a PS&D report where they would talk about total consumption. They would talk about supply, and that report, it's pretty critical, right? We have a monthly WASDE. Why don't we have something similar on fertilizer where we can talk about the fact that, why doesn't the industry know that 40% of phosphates are produced in China? And how is a grower supposed to make decisions? How are they supposed to know when China, at the end of last year, announced they weren't going to export any phosphates through August?
You could frame this as a national security issue almost.
Truly.
Or if you go on your economist soapbook, it's a public good, and it's hard for one organization to do it, but the benefits of the industry and producers being able to invest and make decisions and plan creates value.
Truly. And then up until 2014, it's like the ag prices survey that USDA, NASS continues to publish. Up until April of 2014, they published monthly price data across not only a national level, but regional level on 30 fertilizer products.
Right.
Now they put out an index of nitrogen, and they combine phosphate and potash together. How is that? It's not particularly useful, right? So
a little grumpy about that for research purposes, actually. We need granular data to be able to understand the impact of cost increases.
Yeah. So we would argue that, yes, we absolutely want more transparency, but USDA has been, and I know a lot of that is resource, a resource limitation,
absolutely.
And they do the best that they can with the resources that they have, but
absolutely,
let us direct some more resources to them for the collection and production of fertilizer-related reports and data, because clearly the industry, and I mean this like industry in a larger sense, the grower community, the fertilizer community, all of us together, the research community, we need this information in order to make informed decisions.
Yep.
So there is a pretty big hole on the data side, and we also would very much like to see that. So there's that element for sure. And then, yes, we've been pushing for several years And USDA is now moving forward with the hire of a crops input economist.
That's great.
Again, I don't mean to bemoan this, but there's not a single person at USDA that is expert on crop inputs.
Oh my.
They haven't had a person dedicated to understanding fertilizer
Yeah.
markets in decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I know this is a resource constrained situation. This is not
Yeah.
I get that, but the world has changed, right? In a situation where since 2020 there has been this much volatility, when we have a situation where Russia, who is exporting between 15 and 20% of both NP and K, is 4 years into a war with Ukraine. And there are certain countries that will trade with them. There are certain countries that won't. And it's rerouting trade flows. Growers deserve to know this, right? And that how that fits into pricing. All of this needs to be better known. USDA needs to know this too, right? That they need up-to-date information. So we're really glad that USDA has chosen to create that position in the Office of the Chief Economist and are working to fill it. And we're ecstatic, if I can be so bold. So that's an incredible step forward, but we also need a lot more public-facing data and recognizing that USDA needs more money in order to do that. And yeah, on the legislative side, there have been a number of bills to mandate different reporting, mandatory reporting.
But what does that mean exactly?
Yeah,
Sort of new to me.
Follows a lot of it was written in a very similar way to livestock mandatory reporting. Our industry is quite a lot different than the packing industry. So I'm not sure that it was. We've had a lot of discussions with both the House and the Senate ag committees and their members to have some pretty constructive conversations of like, yeah, we're all about making sure additional data and information is out there, but let's make sure we're providing it in such a way that is providing a full picture. Because there is price reporting occurring. Bloomberg publishes on terminal lots of prices weekly, and the U.S. prices and import prices are the same by and large.
Have the futures market for urea, right?
Yeah. So there's I don't mean to diminish folks' desire to have more data and information, and regional prices matter. And I get that, but I think that there's probably tools that already exist that if USDA were better equipped to or funded to handle it, could probably already exist in order to handle that.
Okay. So that's something that's being ironed out right now.
I hope
being discussed. Yeah. All right. Well, definitely keep following that one. We've already talked quite a bit. I want to start wrapping up, but one question I have, and we alluded to it a bit earlier, is, if you think about trade or domestic production, how long it takes time to put on a plant, you're making decisions, and these could be investment decisions, or you're making policy, and the current needs are urgent, but then it's 10 years and maybe the world is different. How is that being balanced, or how are you balancing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something our members have to deal with, right?
Right.
I don't get involved as a trade association. We don't get involved.
The you all of you.
Yeah. So the best that I can do and what we, just like growers, right? We're members of trade associations where we talk in ways that are in compliance, of course, with antitrust provisions. But like, what could we do as a group to say, if the market conditions were to present themselves, we want to make sure the policy doesn't get in the way of that? How can we advocate together to make sure that the policy isn't the limiting agent?
Yeah.
Because the market hasn't been stable. The policy hasn't been stable. And does make for a very challenging investment horizon. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. All right, 2 questions I always ask everybody, and they're very much optional. The first one, do you feel like there's something that is misunderstood about your work?
About our work?
About what you do as an economist, about I mean,
Mhm.
you could define that how you see fit, or you could pass. Doesn't matter.
There's so much that is misunderstood about the fertilizer industry, and it's predominantly our fault. We didn't talk about ourselves at all for a very long time because nobody cared, and that's fair enough, right? It showed up, and that was good enough. And now in times of crisis is a really bad time to try to explain yourself because
Right.
everything seems like an excuse. And I wish that weren't the case. So we want to be partners, and we consider ourselves, of course, partners with growers. I think that is oftentimes something that I've seen in the last several years is that maybe folks can think that we consider ourselves adversarial, and we don't. If growers don't exist, we don't exist, and truly. And so I think that is maybe a growing misconception
Right.
because the volatility that is out there, to your last question, the volatility doesn't help us either.
Yeah.
We would
Absolutely.
also like to grow when, our wholesalers, we talked about the production, like the growth in the production, but our wholesalers, our retailers, they're also in the market buying.
Yep.
They
Yep.
also
Absolutely.
are like, what's going on? We're having a really hard time figuring out the markets. And is the Strait of Hormuz closed? Is it not? Is
Right.
Russia and Ukraine coming to an agreement? How much damage was there done in Oman? We don't know,
Yeah.
right? It's really challenging for us as well. And I don't intend for that to be like, now we feel bad for the fertilizer industry, because no, but that the volatility doesn't help us either.
Yeah.
And
It
it's not,
affects everybody.
yeah, so it is not intended. We do not consider ourselves to be adversaries at all. We are partners, and we want to work more with growers.
Yep. Yep. That's great. So now, if you could change one policy, what would it be? I'm sure you have a list of policies you'd like to change.
Do.
It's like picking your favorite child.
If I could change one thing, it would be to put time limits on review of permits in the Clean Air and in the Clean Water
Yeah.
Act, those environmental policies.
Yeah.
And that would, I think that applies in the point source space. It applies in the non-point source space when
Okay.
that has such a chilling effect on investment
Yep.
and plans, right? You miss entire business cycles. You are not able to respond to market signals
Yeah.
when it's taking that long,
Mhm.
when you get a decision, and then
Yeah.
because the process allows for, oh no, we're going to review a decision that was already made, and there's just such a long waiting period, it ends up years and years and years. It's such a stifling impact.
My last guest, actually, we were talking about actually rural labor issues, but this was one thing that he brought up, that the time to open a business
Mm,
matters a lot for rural areas.
it's well, and what industry was that guest in, or specific?
He was labor professor, but we were talking
Okay, okay,
about labor. But he also served on city council, and so he was saying, actually, like, if we think about the time that it takes to open a business, this can matter a lot for how many businesses located in your
yeah,
community. So
that's interesting.
that was 2 days ago. So sorry, very fresh in my mind. I'd like to end this. I think I'd like to end with optimism, but before, can we go back to what's at stake? So, with these trade disruptions, with the conflict.
Certainly, there's a lot on the line when you think about this seasonality.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and we think about who's in the market buying when, right? So,
Yeah.
when the Strait of Hormuz first closed, the U.S. was
Yeah.
obviously the big buyer in the market,
Yeah.
and we saw that huge spike in
Yeah.
urea prices. The
Yeah.
U.S. and Australia and India, their first purchase of urea, we were all big buyers in the market, and now demand has fallen to seasonal lows, which is globally,
Mm.
which is the pattern.
Mhm.
And China came in they returned to the market as a supplier. They
Mhm.
said, hey, we're going to show up with 2 to 3 million tons. So
Mhm.
We're at a seasonal low, and then we have now a big supply. So prices have fallen back down. The Chinese are not particularly reliable, as we all know. And we're getting ready to come into the end of Q3, the beginning and Q4 is a big demand season because we're now getting ready to bring on the big South American buyers, right? You've got Brazil, you've got Argentina.
Yeah.
We've got the Indians for a different reason. If the strait remains closed, if we then see prices climb again as a result of that, more constricted supply hitting elevated demand, we're likely to see that result in probably lower applications, less use in Brazil.
Yep.
What does that mean to production in South America? Because the question that I get, that I've been getting, which is absolutely fair from a non-ag audience, is when is this going to show up in consumer prices? And so far it hasn't, right? For the most part, this is so different from 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine because the Middle Eastern countries that are impacted are not ag producers. Global supply of most commodities, we're pretty flush, right? So there's some ability to withstand some variability. But if we're looking at the strait remaining closed for South American application, and we start looking at those global supplies of the big commodities remaining or coming down, right? And USDA starting to come down, that's going to start looking a little different in those commodity markets. The strait remains closed and we enter into the U.S. buying season and it comes back around. What does that look like for U.S. application?
Yeah.
Right. So
I mean,
the big takeaway is that the rest of the world cannot make up for the lost production in the Middle East. Those countries are about 40% of global urea exports, by about 25% of global phos exports, or 50% of global sulfur exports. They're about 20% of global ammonia exports. There's just not that much additional export capacity elsewhere.
Yeah.
Depending on how long the strait remains effectively closed, will have a significant impact on. At some point, we will start looking at that having an impact on commodity prices. And if it remains closed for an extended period of time, to your earlier question about investment, then I think we start looking at potentially a permanent change in the fertilizer industry. Then you're like, hey, if we're a year in, you start looking at folks saying, now the investment picture looks different, right? The supply looks different today. We've had more supply destruction in that region than previously thought. So that's I think the long-term takeaway is if we're looking at the next maybe 6 to 9 months, I think the U.S. our impact will be a bit more limited, particularly on the nitrogen side. If we get back, if it remains closed and we swing back around into the U.S. spring, we're looking at a whole cycle of global production on those commodities, then I think the picture starts looking a bit different.
So there's absolutely real downside.
Potash markets, completely unaffected.
There you go.
We get about 95% of all of our potash from Canada. The rest of the world is getting their potash from Canada, Russia, Belarus. The Chinese get theirs from Laos. There's very little potash west of the strait and cutoff. So the long-term outlook on potash is quite rosy. There's additional capacity coming on in Canada. BHP is coming online with additional capacity in 2027. So the long-term outlook on potash looks quite good.
Thank Canada. All right. Well, terrific. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I've really, really learned a lot. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for reaching out and for having the conversation.
Thanks so much for joining this episode of Smoke and Mirrors as we dig into the policies driving food and agriculture today and in the future.